You're listening to the Max Planck Lawcast, which showcases the academic research currently being conducted across the Max Planck Law Network. I'm your host, Christopher Murphy, and together we'll be talking to some of the more than 400 researchers who are pushing the frontiers of legal knowledge in Germany and abroad. When it comes to new and exciting legal research, the Lawcast has you covered. So imagine I'm chilling on the Max Planck Law yacht in the South China Sea. All of a sudden, on one side a US destroyer pulls up, and on the other side, a Chinese patrol boat comes into view. Both are claiming rights over the same stretch of water that I happen to be on. The American captain cites freedom of navigation, whereas the Chinese captain claims border protection. Interestingly, they both believe that they're following international law. Now, how can two superpowers look at the same body of water and claim different rights over it? My guest today, Malcolm Jorgensen, argues that the era of a single rule-based order is retreating. In its place, the world is actually fracturing into spheres of influence where the law is increasingly whatever the local superpower says it is. Malcolm is a senior research fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law and International Law, and today we're going to be discussing how China, Russia, and the US are competing to rewrite the definition of legitimate global power. Malcolm, welcome to the Lawcast.
Thank you very much for having me, Chris.
Yeah, it's wonderful. I know we tried to line this up a few times over the past, and I always thought it's very topical, and it's remained topical, though, which is great. So thanks for being here with me. Yeah, let's maybe begin with the big picture. In recent years, we've seen a sharp increase in public attention about international law, whether it's countries or leaders being taken to international courts, or about the discussions about the legality of wars and a split in global opinion. Now, in your paper that I read for this podcast, you argue that the international legal order as we know it is actually fragmenting into geo-legal orders. What does this mean, and why is it happening now?
Yes, thanks for the question. So perhaps I should lay my cards on the table in a sense. And as a theorist, I come from an area of international law generally referred to as comparative international law. And so this is a way of getting to this concept of geo-legal ordering. But comparative international law sounds somewhat contradictory in the sense that there's a single international legal system, we think. But there's this area of scholarship which has looked at the way that actually countries think about and interpret law in quite different ways. And so we can go back to 2017. There was a groundbreaking book which posed the question, is international law really international? And that reversed the traditional question that we ask our students of whether international law is really law. But this book by Anthea Roberts looked at the way that particularly the 5 members of the Permanent Security Council actually have different cultural and ideological and political commitments, and these inform the way that we think about international law, which seems somewhat unsurprising that law is a sociological phenomenon as well. So I've looked at that body of work in my own research. So my 2020 book on American foreign policy, ideology, and the international rule of law looked at the way that within the United States, there are different conceptions of law. Now in 2026, I look out at the world and see that these different conceptions of the law are being expressed by major powers. But what it means that in some of the most consequential disputes, core values and core rules of international law, such as sovereignty, the idea of the UN Charter, or international law itself, are no longer agreed on. So we can see this, for instance, in China's claims in the South China Sea, which you alluded to in your introduction, that China claims certain restrictions on other countries when they travel through territorial waters, particularly with military ships, which other countries don't agree with. But China can essentially make effective within its sphere of influence. Russia makes certain expansive claims into Ukraine's territory, the basis for its war there. And if there's any peace settlement there, which is anticipated, it seems likely that Russia's claims will be made essentially ratified, even though they're not recognized as international law. And we now see the United States also carrying out certain attacks in its part of the world on Venezuela and Venezuelan ships, etc. And there's no reasonable prospect of dislodging the United States from that. So we see both these different comparative conceptions of law, but they're also clearly happening within spheres of influence. And that's why I've argued that we should take the logic which is long defined, for instance, geopolitics, and more recently, a large body of literature on geoeconomics, and apply this to law. The underlying logic here is that a geostrategic logic that remakes politics or remakes economics. And so my argument essentially is that the ideal of international legal order is being displaced by what I would refer to as geolegal orders. And so these are spheres of influence in which the geostrategic power governs the interpretation and operation of international law. And this is really a reflection of the fact that there's a fracturing of global political power. And as a result, law cannot withstand that forever, given that law and international legal order is a dimension of the global political order.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that rundown. And it's good that you mentioned China, Russia, and the United States, which are three countries we will be looking at today. I wanted to ask, though, about the fact that we did hear a lot of talk in previous decades coming from leaders saying that they need to defend the global order, defend international law, and they're often appealing to what they refer to as the rules-based order, or the RBO. Now, from what you're saying and what one sees and reads in the news, there are certain countries, such as China and Russia, who, and not only, there's a whole lot of countries who view the rules-based order as being not actually a fair set of universal rules, but rather as a strategic tool for Western dominance. Can you kind of give us your take on that?
Yes, very happy to. I'm kind of obsessed with the rules-based order. So some people love baking and some people love puppies. I love the rules-based order. And the reason is that all of my work as an interdisciplinary scholar looking at the politics of international law, and the concept of the rules-based order sits right at that intersection of what global politics and global law. And so there's not a single meaning to it, and that's part of what makes it interesting. So some strands of historical context. One of them is that the rules-based order terminology has only really arisen in relation to a sense of disordering. So for a long period, particularly under US hegemony, there was just the order. But as there were contestations of that increasing, there needed to be some kind of language to refer to, well, what was that order that we thought that we had, which we now feel is under threat? And so it's referred to as the liberal international order, but that was a bit ideological. And so it then was called the rules-based order. So that's one strand of thought. I think also the idea of the rules-based order is sometimes used as a synonym for international law. Or the international legal order, particularly by policymakers. And I think there's some practical reasons that I do know, working with international lawyers, that they're all waiting to jump down your throat if you say something's international law, but it's not actually technically law. And so it's easier to say the rules-based order. And so there are these different strands that have led to the use of this terminology. The consequence is that it is a political frame for international law. It's a political concept, but embedded in it is an idea of law. And I think this is where I've really tried to contribute to the discourse, is that international lawyers have strongly rejected the language of the rules-based order as a detraction from the special character of legal normativity. But my argument has been for some years that, well, policymakers and political figures are shaping international law, and they do so talking about the rules-based order. And international lawyers have essentially exempted themselves from this discourse by saying, we don't want to touch this concept which detracts from law. And so my response here is that there are two ways that international lawyers might think about the rules-based order. One is a positivist meaning, positivist in the sense that we can identify actual legal rules of order, and then a penumbra around it of political norms which aren't legally binding, but give some meaning to those rules. So that's the meaning preferred by the German Foreign Office, for instance. But the second meaning that I'm much more interested in is that it also has a comparative international law meaning. So if we think of there are distinct interpretations and concepts of international law, and we're trying to describe what is the generally Western liberal idea of law, we could refer to that as the rules-based order conception of international law. And that has a particular focus on principles like democracy and human rights, but has also very much been shaped by US hegemonic power. And so that then gets really to answer the heart of your question, which is that, well, why do countries like China and Russia reject the idea of the rules-based order? It's because the concept and the discourse has been developed in response to a sense of disruptions by those states. It establishes certain values such as democracy and human rights, which stigmatize those states as being somewhat illegitimate within the international order. And lastly, the rules-based order has infamously been very inconsistently applied. It's reflected double standards, that essentially it's whatever these Western states say is the rules-based order is then used to critique China and Russia. And so it becomes this quite flexible tool. And so it really was designed around an opposition to these countries' influence in the global order.
Okay. Well, when you say that, then it does kind of make sense that it is a contested kind of set of principles. You were talking about that it grew out of America. Was this post-Second World War then?
Yeah, it's more recent, it seems, that the term rules-based order has been used. So really post the Cold War, at the end of the Cold War, that there's been this increased use. And so countries like Australia, for instance, were very much at the forefront of using this terminology. And now there's some retreat from it. But I think that the death of the rules-based order has been declared a number of times. And then people always return to this idea because, again, there are these different ideas of it. But if we understand it as being this conception of international law being more legitimate to the degree that it supports democracy and human rights, well, a lot of people support that, even though they might criticize the language of the rules-based order.
Okay. Right. Well, I now want to know, you've given us a nice introduction to the rules-based order and discussed some of the conflicts surrounding it. I'd like to now look at a central theme of your work, which is hegemonic legitimacy. How does a superpower go beyond, I guess, flexing its military muscle and might and economic power to actually making a version of the law that feels natural or right to the rest of the world? Because I figure if we're talking about different views of the order, countries need to be able to bring this across and say, no, we've got this one take, but why don't you listen to us as well? So how do they go about doing this?
Well, I mean, I always feel like apologizing a little bit for the terminology hegemonic legitimacy.
There's a worse term coming up later on.
I'm glad that you've put that out there for the listeners. So we first of all have to think about the idea of political legitimacy. And so remember that I'm talking here in the context of comparative international law. So not just generally about global order, but that there are these different conceptions of international law and states are contesting between them, of trying to argue that one version and interpretation of international law is more legitimate than this interpretation. And these aren't simply doctrinal questions where we can both sit together and look at a treaty. It's that there's a different underlying idea of what the global political order is and therefore what the law should be on the top of that foundation. And so political legitimacy in this context would be the rightful authority to decide between alternative approaches and conceptions of international law. Now, how does one vindicate that? The assumption of much of international law is that there's some underlying consensus on the most fundamental principles. That although states disagree on many day-to-day issues, that they have agreed since at least the Second World War on the core principles of sovereign equality of states, as the UN Charter, as the cornerstone of the international legal order, and that international law itself is the way that we resolve these disputes. The problem is that what's becoming evident in the current disorder is that there was never really a consensus on these particular principles, but rather there was the appearance of consensus that it was synthesized through hegemony. And so hegemony becomes really important here as a particular form of power. So if we think of hegemonic power, what's distinctive about that form of power is that it's not merely power within a system, but it's power over a system that actually defines the meanings of legitimacy in the system. And so this is more the kind of meaning that, for instance, the Italian philosopher Antonio Gramsci would use to talk about hegemonic power, that it's power that is so complete that it creates a sense of its own rightness or oughtness, and that those within the system accept it naturally. So a hegemonic system becomes one where merely by following apparently neutral rules, one reinforces the structures of power that uphold the system. And this is the kind of construct that has been developed through the rules-based order, or as it's often also termed, the liberal international order, as we've discussed. And it's this idea that the liberalism of the order, the idea that the most legitimate type of states are liberal democracies, for instance, all of these ideas have long been even unstated, that it was just assumed this is the most legitimate way of existing in the international order. And this is also sold almost as a positive attribute in the system, that hegemony was a good thing. So some international relations theorists talked about hegemonic stability theory, the idea that by having a hegemon like the United States in the system, this was great for the system because it upheld stability and it all depended on these liberal principles. And so this has now become clearer and clearer as this increasing contestation of the political basis for the order. And so the decline of hegemony is not necessarily the loss of US dominance, but it is the reappearance of the underlying structures of power, that they no longer seem so natural and unquestioned. And so I then have turned to this concept of the need for, or the quest for, a new hegemonic legitimacy in international law. And that's really what these countries such as China and Russia are contesting the order are trying to establish. That is, discourses or ideologies that define the hierarchies of rightful authority over international law. And this would be both in relation to the hierarchies between states and also the hierarchies between their conceptions of international law.
Okay, and so if we then accept that there is this shaking up of the post-Cold War world, there are other countries now looking to have their world view or their view of the legal order, international law, established, legitimatized. Where does this take us if we accept that the world is kind of fracturing into different poles, different areas? How will international law change if we can? We no longer have one set of legitimate global rules, but rather competing centers of power, such as the global West, the global East, the global South, and so on.
Well, I might start from the last part of your question of referring to this global West, global East, global South. So John Eikenberry is the foremost theorist of the liberal international order, advocating its merits, in essentially replicating some of these hegemonic structures of power through talking about the naturalness and the preference for this kind of order. And so in 2024, he wrote about this division of the world into the global West, so being mostly Western, Northern European and others countries, the global East comprised of China and Russia, and the global South as a number of developing countries, including major rising powers such as Brazil or India, etc. And he essentially argued that the future of the world will be decided as a contest between these different centers of power, with the global South almost being this kingmaker, that where the global South leans towards either the global West or East might decide much of the outcome of the future order. I would just note as a side note that Alexander Stubb, the Finnish president, in this last year wrote about what he thought would be the future of international order. And it was notable that he said, I think I would call it the global West, global East, and global South, using these exact same terms. I don't know what the connection is with Eikenberry's work, but it was the same arguments. And so he's somebody actually in a position of power. And so there will be this shifting arrangements of power. I think maybe the null hypothesis, what I don't think we'll see, is the kind of world order that was predicted by the German Nazi legal theorist Carl Schmitt. So Carl Schmitt was the leading theorist during the period of the National Socialists and is very much discussed today, which I think is extremely interesting in itself. He did have, I think, quite a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between power and law. But perhaps more to the point, he has become very popular in Russia and China amongst academics in talking about how the future world is likely to look. So in some ways, it's the written word of Schmitt which has been made real. And so Schmitt's idea was that the world will be divided into a number of co-equal Großräume, or what he would call a Großraum was a greater space in international law where there'd be a leading country at the center, such as Nazi Germany, and then around it would be a number of dependent countries, and that this was the way to have the most secure and international order, that you would have a number of these Großraums and that they would respect each other's boundaries and that there'd be a particular conception of law at the center of each of these political units. That's simply not a realistic prediction of how the world will work, because in practice, countries will continue to fight even more so at the boundaries between these different areas. And so that's not what we're going to see, even though that is the way that it's discussed by some of these theorists who are challenging the international order. So what we will see, many have talked about a turn to a multipolar international order. We can talk about that. It has very contested meanings, though, of what actually a multipolar international order means in practice. And really, we're going to see more complexity as countries position themselves between these different geolegal orders, as I've called them, and decide whether to comply with geolegal rules or what they would consider international rules. In other words, what we're more likely to see is disorder.
Right. So it sounds like you're certainly not going to be out of a job anytime soon.
Yes, it's a mixed blessing.
That's right, exactly. Okay, disorder. Wow, all right. Well, Malcolm, you and I are going to take a short break now, but when we return, we're going to discuss, and this was the other tricky word I had trouble with, the concept of civilizationism, and we're going to be talking about how this is shaping the behavior of some of the world's biggest powers.
Welcome to Max Planck Law, one of the world's largest networks for legal research, based in Germany. Our world-class institutes invite applications for fully funded PhD and postdoc opportunities in almost any area of law. Join a thriving community of over 400 researchers in an international and interdisciplinary environment. Experience the high quality of life that Germany offers while collaborating with colleagues across institutes, working and writing in English. We provide you with unique specialist libraries, excellent workspaces, and support in developing your research and your academic career. Apply today. For more information, visit law.mpg.de.
Okay, well, welcome back to the Max Planck Lawcast. I'm here today with Malcolm Jorgensen. And Malcolm, I'd like to now pivot to the topic of civilizationism. Why is it, maybe you can briefly explain the topic for our listeners, but why is it that world leaders are now talking about their countries as ancient civilizations rather than modern nations?
Okay, so the way that I'm thinking about this from an international law perspective is, up to this point, we've talked about the fact that there is this geolegal ordering, as I've called it, that countries are making particular conceptions of law effective within their own sphere of influence. But this doesn't produce an international legal system. These are essentially political norms that, although they're called law, they're only effective political norms within that region. In order to have an actual system of international law, there needs to be some kind of normative coherence. It's the basic assumption, is that there's something that holds the integrity of the system together. And so what we've talked about up to this point is the role of liberalism as trying to bring that through hegemony. So not consensus, but because of overweening American power and the power of the West, that assumptions that liberalism had this universality which tied the system together played an important role. As this is being contested, states have tried to turn to other concepts of what the order is. It's not a rules-based order. It's not the liberal international order. Many have converged on the idea of a multipolar international order. And so this has some resonance symbolically, the idea that there might be more diversity, etc., but it doesn't offer a concrete set of ideas that can directly respond to liberalism. Liberalism has these substantive ideas of democracy or human rights, but multipolarity requires something more in order to vindicate it. And this is where I think civilizationism really is the counterpoint to liberalism. And so, as you've pointed out, there are a number of these powerful states, such as China, Russia, but also India and Turkey, who claim some kind of primordial connection to their country, the civilizations or cultures going back thousands of years, and that this is being used as a new, if you like, ontological basis for the international order. That is, liberalism claims this is just a universal truth, that people want these liberal freedoms and rights. You can respond to that and say a universal truth is that countries and people have always been part of civilizational identities, and these go back into the mists of time. And so that you can build an order upon that that has more legitimacy than the particularism of liberalism. So the term that I've used, civilizationism, I think probably one of the leading accounts is there was a piece in International Studies Review from 2023 by Gregorio Batista and others, and they define civilizationism as a counter-hegemonic ideological reaction to the globalization of the liberal international order. And what's important is that it does provide some of these substantive ideas which can actually respond to the ideas of liberalism. And what these states have tried to do is essentially establish what you could call a new standard of civilization. That is, in the past, in colonial eras, Western states would say that there was a standard of civilization that many non-Western states did not meet as a way of excluding them from the system. The new standard of civilization that seems to be emerging is that these states, such as China and Russia and others, have said that we are the truest kind of states, civilization states, and that this is the standard that should set everything else in international law. And so that's how it becomes a new legitimacy, or if you like, eventually maybe a hegemonic legitimacy, as I've called it, where that sets the basis for how you structure the international system and what units it's actually trying to preserve.
Okay. Then let's maybe take a couple of examples of this civilizationism in action. Let's start with China. China often highlights its 5,000-year history as a civilization. How is this identity then being used to claim that they have an equally legitimate way of interpreting the law than this Western liberal model?
Well, I think the first point to make is that nothing I'm saying is denying the idea that there might be elements that could be called a civilization in an anthropological or archaeological sense. That certainly China does have this very ancient history. What I'm interested in here, though, is the way that discourses are developed around this in order to create new hierarchies of power in international law. This might also sit upon ideas like civilizationism as an ideology. I'm looking here at the way that China is using this claim to a 5,000-year-old history in order to expand its rights under international law or contract the rights of other states under international law. And essentially, it's this idea that China is not just a state, but it's a civilization state. And so this is something that has influenced thought right up to the highest levels of the Chinese governments, including influencing, for instance, President Xi Jinping. This idea that Western states came along and started claiming that what they said was the international law, apparently established from the Westphalian Treaty in the 1600s, but China had been there for thousands of years prior in its telling. Although China has signed up to the international order, as a core member of the United Nations and the UN Security Council, it essentially refracts understandings of sovereign equality through its perceived 5,000-year-old history. How this actually then works in practice, for instance, it's important for us to see how this is co-constitutive with its geolegal claims. And so I know we're working with a number of different concepts here at once, but I think it's important to see the way that they intersect. I think the way that law works is that countries have particular geostrategic interests, that they desire certain territory for security reasons or economic reasons. And this plays back and forth with the ideologies and the discourses they tell even themselves of justifying why they legitimately can claim certain areas. And so clearly China has a geostrategic interest in its near seas. It wants something similar to the American Monroe Doctrine, in that there's an area of seas which give it a security buffer zone where it's not surrounded by hostile powers. And so that includes the South China Sea. It also includes the area where Taiwan is. And so there's a geostrategic explanation for why China is wanting these areas. But it's reinforced by a civilizational identity. And China is, I think, genuinely this is believed by many Chinese leaders, but they've certainly also sought to demonstrate it through archaeological evidence, for instance, of China's civilization in the South China Sea or in its claims over Taiwan. And so you can see where these ideas of civilization become the basis for demarcating legal rights within a geolegal sphere, and that this is an alternative to liberal understandings, that it's not about the self-determination and the desire for liberal freedoms of the people of Taiwan. It's civilization which determines that. And the same thing in terms of the South China Sea, that it's not about respecting modern sovereign rights agreed in treaties since the Second World War that determine the borders of the South China Sea, but rather something going back into, again, the mists of time, which is essentially unfalsifiable and is done on a self-judging basis by China. And so therefore becomes very difficult to argue against as the basis for its legal rights.
Okay, thank you for that rundown there. Let's now leave China behind and move to Russia. Russia's obviously been in the news a lot over the last 4 years at least, and with the invasion of Ukraine. What we also often hear about in the media is Vladimir Putin's passionate interest in Russian history and civilization. How is his interest, and also, I guess, the wider interest of the Russian political elite in this history going to continue to affect not only Ukraine, but also other countries in Eastern Europe?
Again, we could start from the geostrategic analysis of what Putin's doing. And so Putin has talked about the collapse of the Soviet Union as being the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. And part of the reason for that is because it removed the buffer zone, the security buffer zone that protected Russia from Western Europe. And so you had all of these countries along its western flank, which were considered to be part of the Russian world. And after the Cold War, many of these countries started to align with the West, so moving outside of Russia's sphere of influence. And so you see these states which are right at the cusp of two claimed civilizations, and Ukraine is right there in the middle of that. That Ukraine looks towards the West, wants to be part of NATO and the European Union, whereas Russia sees it as an integral part of its country, as well as an important security zone to protect it against these other countries. Russia looks at its own position and compares it again to the United States and says that, well, the United States has these oceans and friendly countries all around it. Why can't Russia have the same thing? This is where we see this meeting of these geostrategic interests and also these civilizational interests. So as you said, Vladimir Putin apparently during Corona became completely obsessed with Russian history and wrote these treaties on this, talking about the ancient union of Ukraine and Russia, and that there were these integral parts joined also by language. And so civilization, the perceived distinct Russian civilization, became the basis for drawing the borders of Russian sovereignty. And so then we can see directly where a specific rule of international law, sovereign equality, becomes interpreted through these civilizational lenses. That sovereign equality really means Russia's equal ability to stand up as one of the centers of power of the world against other centers of power and to balance against them. And that really requires, in practice, sovereign inequality, because it must be able to ride over the countries such as Ukraine, which are really dependent on the civilizational center of Russia, rather than being countries in their own right, if we think of this civilizational approach. And so there are many reasons why the war is so intractable in Ukraine, but amongst them is that I think Putin has this genuine belief in this idea of a Russian identity. Perhaps if anybody's interested in this, a colleague, Laurie Malksu, wrote a book on Russian approaches to international law in 2015, and he's just written essentially a sequel on Russia, the Soviet Union, and imperial continuity in international law. And so he covers many of these issues very well, which explains the deep-rooted nature of the ideologies behind this war.
Okay. I think it's really interesting there. You came back to there, you were saying that as Ukraine is one of these countries that's torn between two of these Großraum or Großräume, spheres of influence, and that's obviously that tear will run all the way down Eastern Europe in the case of the West and Russia.
Exactly. I mean, this is the point, this is the great flaw, there are many of them, but the great flaw in Carl Schmitt's idea of the Großraum is that this wouldn't be a formula for peace, because countries will continue to contest the borders of their perceived spheres of influence. That the idea that geolegal orders, hopefully this more neutral term for talking about that, essentially would still have even more intense contestation potentially at their peripheries. And it's not clear where Vladimir Putin's aspirations lie. So he's almost explicitly invoked Schmidt when he said that he looks forward to a great space in Europe around Russia, and that is extended as far as Portugal in some tellings. And so it really doesn't take away the need to hold back through other means of force these kind of aspirations.
Okay. Well, now let's turn to the great power of the day, and at least the great power for the last several decades, the United States. Obviously, lucky to be geographically surrounded by a lot of ocean, but nonetheless, under President Trump, America has become increasingly assertive. We've seen military confrontations in the Caribbean, Venezuela, as you mentioned before. The Middle East, as we are recording this, there's discussions about Iran and its nuclear program and possible military intervention. And we've also seen a lot of controversial claims about the status of countries, including Canada and Greenland. Now, why would the US, which, as you mentioned, is one of the key architects of the international legal order, why is it beginning to play by its own rules?
Okay, so maybe we'll start from the same point of analysis as the last couple of countries we talked about, which is from a geostrategic point of view. As has been pointed out, the United States has something that it refers to as the Monroe Doctrine. And that's been around for some couple of hundred years, but it is essentially the idea that the United States is able to hold out competitors within its sphere of influence. And so any attempts at colonization by European powers was considered to be unfriendly to the United States itself. This language disappeared because of its clear colonial overtones from the United States. The Obama administration refuted this concept, but it is now right at the center of the Trump administration's policy. So the 2025 National Security Strategy reestablished the Monroe Doctrine explicitly in what was referred to as a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And it's unclear what that actually is, but it's certainly a recommitment to this idea of the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine sets out this idea that the United States should be able to guard its particular sphere of influence. But of course, this needs some basis for legitimacy. I think the null hypothesis here again is that Stephen Miller, this ethno-nationalist advisor to President Trump, came out recently and said the only real law is that of he used kind of language like it was the iron law of nations, is that it's great powers who essentially get what they want. And that's the null hypothesis in the sense that that's not going to be how things proceed, that it's not going to be the United States making its claims without reference to law. Rather, what we're more likely to see is that Donald Trump, in an interview to the New York Times, was asked, well, do you need to follow international law? And he said, I do think that we do, but it depends what international law means. And so it's retaining this autonomy over the meaning of international law. What then is the legitimacy for this if it's not just going to be the bare assertion of power? And I have observed that there is this shift towards the same civilizational language that some of these other countries are using. And so there's been increasing references to especially a transnational Western civilization, that the United States is defending a Western civilization, and that really the United States is the defender of that Western civilization. And so it now lectures Europe on the ways that Europe is facing what it calls civilizational erasure because of immigration into Europe. And so it's been used in that context. But then there's also been some references to the idea of an American civilization. And so in Trump's second inaugural address in 2025, he described America as history's greatest civilization. And then in his State of the Union that same year, he pledged to forge the freest, most advanced, most dynamic, and most dominant civilization ever to exist on the face of this earth. I mean, it's easy to dismiss a lot of Trump's overstatements that he makes about essentially everything, but there has been this consistent theme of talking about civilization. So Trump's used it in those contexts, but Marco Rubio made it the central theme of his speech to the Munich Security Conference. And so he talked about the question, what exactly are we defending, was the question that he posed to European leaders. And his definitive answer was, we're defending a great civilization that has every reason to be proud of its history, confident of its future, and aims to always be the master of its own economic and political destiny. And so this then helps drive some of these expansive claims over Greenland, over Canada potentially, and certainly the expansive claims that the United States is making in the Caribbean. Its right to commit military strikes against these fishing vessels for quite spurious reasons, but defended in international law language, that these it's a non-international armed conflict, the US calls it, that these are armed combatants. Just to be clear, as a matter of international law, there's no legal basis for the United States to be carrying out those attacks or to be able to take the leader of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, out of that country. There's nothing under international law that allows that. But this interpretation of international law, which is effective within geolegal bounds, is consistent with this idea of some kind of civilizational identity that the United States is able to vindicate.
Does the United States, in this case, risk shooting itself in the foot, considering it has, at least in Europe, a lot of goodwill had, and it's now in danger of actually losing some of its hegemonic legitimacy by acting of its own accord in a way that its its partners, still partners, I would say, don't agree to eye.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've seen this in the past. The United States periodically flirts with the idea of ditching international law because it seems easier to go without it. And so the administration of George W. Bush did the same thing, but there was this sharp shift, and this is what I wrote about in my book and PhD, there was a sharp shift between the first term of the Bush administration and the second term. And the big shift was a realization of a need to re-engage with international law, because even international relations realists would admit that it's just inefficient to keep aggressively asserting power and to look threatening as a strategy in itself, which is essentially what the Trump administration is doing. When as a great power, you can often achieve most of what you want, but you can dress it up in the language of international law and make some concessions around the edges, which still matters in international relations. And so I think we're seeing the United States move back a little bit from that already. Whether or not we'll see that over the long term is more unclear. But yeah, there's just some specific cases where we can now see this playing out. So I'll just give one example, is that the United States is making all these claims to Greenland, and it's unclear how this is going to land. It's, of course, have gone down very badly with its European allies. But essentially, what the United States has demanded, one of the possible resolutions, is that there might be pockets of Greenland that would be provided to the United States and given sovereignty over these particular pockets of land, and that would happen under a treaty. But for that to happen, the United States has been threatening military action if it doesn't get what it wants. And under international law, under the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, Article 52 makes it clear that a treaty that is completed under duress of the use of military force would be void. What we'll see now is an answer to whether a geolegal sphere is forming that includes Greenland, in the sense that if these countries acquiesce to the United States and sign a treaty and they forego their rights to dispute that treaty because of this use of force, then Article 52 wouldn't apply within that geolegal order. And that might become a general feature of geolegal orders, that states appease a leading state in relation to Article 52. And so it's one of the ways that we might see an American geolegal order unfolding.
Okay. Well, if we do then, and this is my final question for you today, see this, as you say, chipping away at geolegal orders and a splitting then possibly into different legal zones or geopolitical zones, how is the world still going to cooperate? Because we still need to cooperate on, there's big issues that we need to deal with. There are global challenges out there. There's climate change, terrorism, and maybe not a challenge, but something that's equally important is trade. Is the era then of global cooperation dead?
No, I wouldn't put it so bluntly, but it certainly faces some very fundamental challenges. So we sort of think of the short, medium, and long term. Of course, first of all, there's electoral cycles. A lot of this is to do with the presidency of Donald Trump. There's every reasonable prediction that Trump might not be the president by the next election, and that you might have a Democrat or at least a more moderate Republican, for instance. And so there might be some shift in the electoral cycle. But over the longer term, that doesn't really resolve this issue because US credibility has been so undercut now. Now every ally knows that even if there's a Democratic administration next time round, whatever agreement you reach might be kicked back in the other direction as soon as there's another Republican in the White House. And so the US is systematically unreliable as a partner. And so that's something that's been established by this administration. So that's sort of short to medium term. But actually, this question comes down to almost a philosophical one, which is that whether or not we can reach cooperative solutions to things like climate change and terrorism and so on, really questions on the resilience of liberal modernity. The idea that states can actually use human reason to be able to reach agreements that they agreed to abide to. This is the broader philosophical meaning of liberalism here. So not just political liberalism, but the idea that there's human progress is possible, that science and rationality can all be a basis for decision makings. And that's also what's being contested here. So I think a really important parallel that needs to be drawn is that we've talked about the way that at the international level, states are concerned with their status. So China and Russia are trying to increase their status by contesting the international order because they believe that their civilizational identity gives them a right to do so. Well, one of the most important explanations for populism and nationalist populism at the domestic level is a sense of loss of status by many of those who have some ethnic or religious or cultural reason to believe that they should have a higher status within society. And so the reasons for contesting ordered governments, constitutional government at the domestic level are very similar to the reasons for contesting global law, for international law. What's been rejected by many of these populist nationalists at the domestic level is the idea that liberal modernity actually is going to offer them a better life, that they want to go back to identities based on blood and ethnicity and even civilization, you might say. And that same set of identities also translates to the international level. And so whether or not we're able to cooperate on these challenges will depend largely on that question of the fate of liberal modernity.
Malcolm, we live in interesting times. I'd like to say thank you very much for helping me kind of navigate those waters today, the geopolitical and legal waters about this whole, it's fascinating. I've learned a lot, and I'd like to thank you very much for the conversation.
It's been my absolute pleasure, Chris. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to the Lawcast. If you'd like more information about Max Planck Law, or if you'd like to get involved, please visit us at law.mpg.de.
Max Planck Law. Excellence in legal research.